You're welcome.
It's now 5 o'clock, and I am calling to order the Board of Education special meeting workshop for Indian Prairie District 204 on Monday, December 20th, 2021. Jeannie, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Donahue.
Here.
Ms. Jane.
Here.
Ms. Fosdick.
Here.
Ms. Grover.
Present.
Ms. Deming.
Present.
Mr. Rising.
Here.
Mr. Krubis.
Here.
We have a quorum. Mr. Matt Shipley and Mr. Rob Schwartz will be presenting the Boundary Committee recommendations.
Start it. Do you want me to kick it off?
I'll start just by saying good evening to the members of the Board of Education. We have with us Rob Schwartz from RSP and Associates. As you know, Rob and his team have been working closely with the district over the past 7+ months since the board approved us to start this boundary process. Tonight's workshop presentation will primarily be driven by Rob, just giving an overview of the process and summarizing where we've been and what some of the challenges we looked at and what we see as some of the opportunities. And we will close with our an administrative recommendation that our team has worked with Rob over the past week or two to develop after the Boundary Committee completed their work on December 8th. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Rob.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And it's a pleasure to be here 5 days before our Christmas holiday and talking about boundaries. And now we have a blank screen. That's never good. It's the board packet one. It's like we're blank. Do you want to hook my computer into it? Or
I have it on a flash.
okay, cool. While they're working on the technology, I'll kind of work through some of the stuff so we can have the maximum amount of time that we need to talk about what's being presented to you from the committee. So we've broken this out. I know in the board packet there's probably like 150 pages in this, so I'm sure you appreciated all of the detail that went into that. But it was necessary because there's a lot of information about what's happening in each of the things that the committee has been considering. And so we'll talk a little bit about how did we get here? Because remember, it started 6 months ago. And so you've already been introduced to me. There's many of my team that's not here tonight working on the analysis, the maps, and trying to help all the different questions that came up, whether it was with the committee, with the community, and then here of late with the Board of Education as you've started to receive that information. And so the process, like I mentioned, started 6 months ago. So back in July, we met with you as a board. We spoke about guiding principles. We spoke about the prioritized boundary criteria. And we talked about the process and what we were needing to talk about. And we'll get into some things where the process actually evolved to, and probably for a very good reason, specifically when we focus in on capacity and what those learning environments might be as we think about this in the next 5 or so years. So if you remember the process, we'll see, does it go blank again? All right, this is good. All right, thank you, technology. All right, so here's the page with the process. So you remember we broke this down where there was going to be some work with the committee, which is the green boxes. So that's back from July 7th all the way through December 8th. So we had 8 different committee meetings, and they worked hard. I don't know if we have committee members that are present here in the public, but really want to thank them. They did a great amount of work, looked into a lot of different issues related to how we define capacity, what we're looking at with feeders, how do we start to align this with some of the given conditions that are occurring within your district. And so that brings us here to December 20th, 2021, where you're going to receive what the committee has worked on for the last 6 months. Again, that's the breakdown of everything. We had this ACE concept. If you remember, we talked about that with you at the board, and this became very apparent when we started having the conversations with the community. What does it really mean when we start to make some of these changes? What's in the culture of those buildings? Can we afford different things? Particularly when I get to capacity, we'll talk about some things that kind of evolved with capacity that's very important to understand how these concepts move their way through the last 6 months. We had these guiding principles. If you remember back in July, we really were talking about what is that sandbox that the committee can work with and giving them some flexibility based on not knowing how things would evolve through that 6-month journey. So the 5 areas that we focused on from that meeting was ensuring that there would be an equitable student experience at each school. So that starts to get into some of the programming that can be in those buildings, some of the programming that may not be in those buildings, but again, trying to provide a good experience for all those students. We wanted to integrate this into the part of the long-range planning of the district, so not having to change these boundaries again and again, and trying to integrate in what's happening with some of these buildings. And we'll come to some of this stuff with capacity in a moment. The third thing was to try to anticipate future changes in the neighborhood. If you remember, we have areas that have been non-residential, and we now have new developments that are going through the city processes where they will now be residential. And so we need to assign them to an attendance area. So it's, again, planning for those future changes. We wanted to continue to effectively utilize all of the available district resources. That gets a little bit tricky when we talk about your district, right? In the north, we have too many kids and not enough capacity. And in the south, we generally have fewer kids with more capacity than what the students can actually fill. So again, trying to have that balance of how do we look at that, and that kind of created the 2 different concepts early on that went to the public. Then we had focus on all grade levels. So again, the boundary changes could occur at each of the levels, the elementary, middle school, and high school. So that was the sandbox that we started out with on July 7th with the committee. We also worked through, I believe, 2 different ways to evolve at a prioritization of the boundary criteria. So we had demographic considerations, and we've looked at that from many different lenses. And depending on the lens that you're looking on with the demographics, you may think one of the concepts or the administration recommendation is more fully fulfilled with that particular item. For instance, what is the residential housing type? Is it single family? Is it apartments? Is it single family attached, detached? If we look at ethnicity, if we look at free and reduced lunch, the special education population, and the English language learners. So a lot of different parts that the committee was trying to look at in identifying how do we best address demographic considerations in those changes. We then had neighborhoods intact was your second criteria. And the focus of that is down to this planning area level. And so think of it as your subdivision, your apartment complex, all that, trying to keep that going to one elementary building, then one middle school, and then one high school. And then the third prioritization was tied between fiscal consideration capital, so trying to limit dollars that would be spent that was not already being allocated in the buildings, and then also balancing the enrollment with the building utilization. Again, I mentioned it was a challenge when we start to look at where kids are, where buildings are, and as we start to associate where those kids should go to school, how far is too far away? and how does that relate to some of our current boundaries? So that was where we left this in July. During that time period, we did another enrollment analysis to ensure, are the trends that we're seeing, are they continuing? So we are showing a declining enrollments. And so that started to help create how much space do we need and what is available to serve those students at each of those levels. We also made it aware of the new developments that were coming online, that's part of our forecast. We've factored in that we're going to see some of these developments in a reasonable timeline, that we're going to see a different type of students depending on that type of development. You guys represented that months ago with the enrollment analysis. So this kind of gets us into the committee work. So when we got to the committee, one of the things that our goal was to give you something that would have some sort of, let's say, consensus, and ideally at about 75%. As we worked our way through the process and got to the last meeting, Concept 1 had 65%. We'll come back to that. So a lot of heavy lifting, and I think there's some things that were learned, some of the things that they mentioned, and some of the things that you'll see in the administration recommendation that kind of starts to get at some of those things and makes it maybe a little bit better, again, depending on the lens that you're looking at. Now, in this process, there were some things that changed quite a bit. And they changed quite a bit as we were getting new information. And the first thing is with capacity. And so we talk about this imbalance of where buildings are and where kids are. So this imbalance between the north part of the district and the south part of the district. We also had conversations that evolved to, is there innovation spaces that we can put into these buildings? And then there was some consideration early on about how do you repurpose or close facilities if there's more capacity than students that could be served. And this is why there's this evolution of capacity. I'm going to let Matt talk a little bit about capacity, because I think this is a very important point, because this became the ultimate synergy of how a boundary could look the way we've been showing it in Concept 1, 3, or the administration recommendation we'll talk about later.
I think as an administrative team, I think we learned a lot about capacity and had a lot of discussions about this as well, as we really looked at what was coming out of the committee and what options we had and also what challenges we had. I will start by saying the capacities we started the process with or have used and are still present when we look at tonight's administrative recommendation. Those are historical capacities that have been used really since those buildings opened. They are lower than the architectural or what you'd consider the fire marshal's maximum capacity, so there is some leeway for making sure we're not, completely full in a building. But for a large part, these are capacities that we've used and haven't really evaluated in many years. In the history of the district, many of our buildings have been at or above these capacities. We have two buildings in Granger and Matea that are still above these capacities. And so, one of the challenges for us as an administrative team is as we really started thinking about what was possible, we do have to look at what should we be using as a capacity going forward, or how do we think of that concept a little more dynamically. I think as we've looked at it, we feel that at the elementary level, we've really seen an evolution in our programming needs. We've seen an increase in the need for intervention services, whether that's ELL students, special ed purpose, special education student services, et cetera. We've also put a priority on lowering class sizes at our K-2 level and at some of our Title I buildings. And so as a result, we really feel at the elementary, some of these listed capacities, we should really be targeting a lower number. And I think if you look at the recommendation, we've kept all our buildings below those capacities, and in most cases, we're well below those capacities. And so we've really, I think, again, adapted a little bit to the changing educational environment and a recognition that at the elementary level, we need to start looking at lowering the maximum number of students in some of these buildings. The middle and high school level, the conversation's a little different, and we do feel much more comfortable having those buildings operate pretty close to that capacity. And that's really just efficiencies that we get with the scheduling, being able to use those rooms for a full day. We have encore and elective space that's maybe not fully factored into those capacity numbers. And then when we get into the high school numbers, we have students that are participating in partial day programs outside of the school day, whether that's a TCD program or other workforce development program. And so maybe we're never really at that number for the full day, for the full school day. So I think what you'll see in our recommendations is that at the elementary level, we're generally staying much below the listed capacity. But then at the middle and high school, we are comfortable recommending being a little closer to those numbers, which at each of our high schools is 2,700, and then our middle schools, depending on the building, is in that 900 to 1,000 range.
Great. And as you can see, some of the bullet points that are up on this slide, Matt was talking about. So these were some of the general themes that, again, evolved, and the committee was pivoting as we learned new information. And we think it was a good pivot because it creates a better understanding of really how will those programs work in those buildings. This slide here gives you that evolution of the concepts and the evolution really of the process. So when we started in meeting 1, right, that was the guiding principles, boundary criteria, and enrollment analysis that the committee embarked on. Then as we got to meeting 2, we had them to start the conversation of what could these boundaries look like. Where were there some hot spots? Where were there some places that we realized there were challenges with the existing system? And that was really the start of, hey, as we look at capacity today at meeting 2, it appeared there is a lot of excess capacity in parts of the district. And so that started the formulation of Concept 1 and Concept 2, where there was buildings that were either repurposed or closed. And because we had this available capacity with the numbers that were available for each of those buildings. So that moved us into meeting 3, and we had a lot of those conversations that continued to move into meeting 4 and meeting 5 and meeting 6. And there was iteration, so the maps kept changing quite a bit. So I know many of you came to those meetings, and as you saw the visuals of the maps coming up, you saw there were changes, and the changes were going back to the conversations that the committee had at those committee meetings. And then could we make some of those changes as it would relate back to those guiding principles and the boundary criteria? Then as we started to move into meeting 6, Concept 2 just fell off. It didn't have adequate support. And Concept 2 is one that we're looking at just repurposing one building on the south side. When we were trying to address capacity, as we were identifying capacity numbers, it looked like there could be 2 buildings that could be repurposed or closed. Then as we moved our way into the public inputs and on into meeting 8, the conversations really started to change with what is the reasoning that you would close or repurpose a building. And it had to be more than just numbers. And I stated this, I believe, at the public inputs. I stated at meeting 8 that there has to be more than just saying it's, let's say, the smaller buildings, or there needs to be more metrics on being able to determine, can you and do you really need to do that? And usually the reasoning is based on finances. Can you afford to keep those buildings? Can you afford to staff those buildings? So as that moved from the public inputs in meeting 7 into meeting 8, Concept 1 made one last change. And what was eliminated was closing or repurposing any elementary building. And so now we had 2 concepts somewhat similar, and I'll show you some different things that are the nuances between them. But as we made that change, some of the conversations that took place in the public inputs no longer had to be addressed the way Concept 3 looked, or Concept 1 looked, going into the public inputs. So if we're not closing, repurposing any buildings, we started to move more of those existing elementaries, middle schools, and high schools back to what is their current boundaries. That's kind of the flow. And that gets us to then the meeting results of what we had with Concept 1 and Concept 3. There were some general themes, and we have this listed on these next few pages. This is really for you to see how it moved its way through. I gave you kind of the executive summary on that particular previous slide. I mean, you can see everything was moving as the committee was instructing and trying to get to that point of what would be the best concept. We do have the survey results from the public input. So you can see we had almost 3,800 responses, so quite a bit. And you can see the breakdown based on their responses of what, in this slide, elementary building they would be associated with. And so this, again, started to give us an understanding of what people were thinking geographically as it related to what was presented at those 3 public inputs. At the final committee meeting, we just took a poll everywhere question, and we had 65% that were more favorable in support of Concept 1 and 35% with Concept 3. A lot of our challenges were with maybe how people perceived capacity, and if there is available capacity, I think there were some committee members that felt that if we have this available capacity, we should be putting forth a plan that would reduce what the capacity is. So when you look at the right slide and you get at what they thought about the process, whether they achieved their goals, some of it's going to be from that perspective. Others are going to be from the perspective of maybe they liked a portion of one of the 2 concepts, let's say at the elementary level, versus the middle school or high school. So there's a lot of differing reasons, and what we tried to get at was something that we can give to you as a board that you would be able to move forward in implementing for the next school year. So with the final committee feedback, here are some of those bullet points of what was provided on either sticky notes or the papers that we had there to give you that perspective of what they were thinking about these 2 concepts. And there was considerably more feedback on Concept 1 and more favorable things with Concept 1. So again, you can look through those things. So if we get into the concepts, so tonight we have 3 concepts that we're going to give you an overview of. The first is Concept 1, the second is Concept 3, and then we're going to do the administration recommended concepts. And there may still be some evolutions with some other things that may come up in the conversation this evening. So remember, we started with the existing elementary boundaries where we have islands. We have some students that are going a fair distance south to be able to go to school. We have broken feeders already, so that's not anything new for the district. So there's the existing high school boundaries. Then as we moved into Concept 1, what the goal here has been is to have compact areas, eliminate the islands, and try to minimize the number of breaks in the feeder. It becomes extraordinarily challenging when we look at where our buildings are located. And as I walk you through some of the maps, this is going to hold true whether I'm talking about Concept 1 or Concept 3 on student locations and where buildings are. So in the middle school, again, you can see if we put the other current boundary up next to this, much more compact in nature where the colors are more solids. Just an observation as you look at this. We'll get into the numbers because the numbers do start to help support what you're seeing visually. So it has to be more than just visually something looks nice. So some of the things that evolved from the public inputs that we tried to address in Concept 1, again, it went away. So a lot of the Welch area, when we no longer were closing repurposing buildings, that area went back to what its existing boundary is. When we heard different comments about Atwater on where their choice might be as it relates to close proximity, you'll see we made a change to Atwater to be able to address that area up on the north. We had other small areas as we worked our way to the south that also we were able to, again, move some things more in line with what the current boundaries are, or more in line with some of the things that we already had been achieving in Concept 3 that the committee had some support on. If you go back to before the public inputs, there was much more support from the committee for concept 3. But then as we had this conversation in meeting 8 and they started to think about things, that's how you got the 65% for concept 1. So you can see each of the different things that started to move here in concept 1, again, to adapt it to the new norm that we were now having with no buildings being closed or repurposed. So our starting point. So some of the things that happens in this concept, if we look at some of the fast facts and summary, we have 7 of the 21 elementary schools have a break in their feeder. Currently, there's 9 of the 21 that do that. So we reduced by 2 schools. We still have splits from middle school to high school. That's something that's current with your current situation. And then we started to try to address in concept 1, we were trying to move things that were closer to each of the high schools. So we had a lot of conversation about that. How far away should a student be from the high school buildings? So there was conversation initially with concept 1 as we got up to 87th Street that should, since it's at Nequa, it should continue at Nequa. We had other conversation when we moved west to 59 that was saying, hey, we're close to Nequa. We'd like to be at Nequa. We don't want to have to go as far north as we currently are having to do. So concept 1 started to really pull that in, that there's more of this node that if you're a certain distance from those buildings, you're likely to be at those buildings, whether it was high school, middle school, or elementary. Just like what we did with the committee, you see a breakdown of how this relates to the guiding principles and to the boundary criteria and to some of the things in the middle section that we tried to address from the public input and administration. We are noting some of the benefits and some of the drawbacks, and as I said in the public inputs and at meeting 8, some of these benefits you as a parent or even as an administrator you might think is actually a drawback, or the converse of that with the drawback. So these are just generalizations of, as we work through this particular process, what this means for concept 1. Again, there's lots of visuals that help illustrate what the feeder is and what breaks are into the feeders, what that all looks like, so you can come back to those. The projections, this is an important piece because there are going to be some buildings that are going to be close to that 95% or more capacity at the elementary. And it wouldn't matter between the concepts. Sometimes it's Brookdale, sometimes it's Brooks. We have that situation depending on how the boundary is. So we know those kids can get there. And I fall back to what Matt was saying with capacity. In some of these buildings, we've had more students than what we're showing would be here in the next 5 years. But how does that relate to the programming is particularly why we said this 95% is important at the elementary. Hey, you can still be in the orange and the programs will function well, but you just have to be cautious that we're at a point with maybe how that building is programmed. At 95%, it's full, right? So you can see what that breakdown is with the enrollments based on where the students reside. How's that going to look in relation to capacity? And remember, I mentioned there's different things that we've been using with capacity. In concept 1, we're just using what is the adjusted capacity. We've listed the innovation because, again, this is a tool that moving forward, as space is available in some of these buildings and you have dollars, you might be able to put some innovation spaces with this boundary plan in concept 1. You'll see the same thing as it relates to the middle schools with the projections and capacity. And the same thing as we then move into some of the ethnicity elements with the special programming. We always list what it currently is and then what it would be based on this particular concept. We show it in raw numbers, and you can see it in percentages. And where we've highlighted where it's orange, there's been a decrease. And where there's green, it's been an increase of more than 5%. So you can see what that change was like. We do the same thing with the middle school programming pieces and the same thing with the high school. Again, there's some things that as you start to examine these tables, some things maybe get a little bit better, some things stay about the same, maybe some others where it increases a little bit more than what it currently was. We also show you that same information that I was alluding to with the type of housing. So is it single-family attached, single-family detached apartments? This is the vernacular both the all the cities are using. Doesn't matter if it's Aurora, Naperville, any of them. They're all using this type of terminology to understand what the developments are. So again, you can see what that looks like currently and what it changes to in the concept and at each level. We show the ethnicity. Again, everything's shaded color if it changed more than 5% up or down. Trying to be transparent in what all of that is. So that's the ethnicity. We get into the students impacted by the boundary change at the elementary level. This is 1,900 students, roughly. And so what we're looking at is if you're currently a kindergarten through 4th grader and the boundary would change, you're impacted going into 1st through 5th grade. If you're a new incoming kindergarten student, the impact, the way we're equating this, you're new to the building, so you probably have not been in the building, so we're saying since you physically weren't there, you're not impacted the same way that if you were already in that building. So again, there's about 1,900. You can see what school they were at, and as you move to the right, what building they would be assigned to with the new boundary. And we do that at each of the levels. So here at the middle school, for Concept 1, there's about 1,900 that are impacted. And then when we go to the high school, it's 1,200. Now, one thing that I'm going to go back to the middle school, because this is important on both Concept 1, Concept 3, and the admin recommendation. What we did here was we looked at if you were 5th through 7th, when you become 6th through 8th, this is that impact. Not knowing what are we going to give 5th graders, is there maybe a potential for a student option? That comes later, right? So I want you to understand what these numbers are. When we get to the high school, it's 8th through 11th. We also gave some information of proximity to the building. So again, just trying to give you all the data that the committee worked with. Do that at each of the levels. We then even have provided where those growth areas are as it relates to each of the elementary attendance areas, the middle school attendance areas, and the high school attendance areas. Again, we've tried to put this into the projections so that we have those number of students in future years. Have to plan for that. So that's Concept 1. We get into Concept 3. Embedded in the map, you're going to see, or the presentation, you're going to see what that visually looks like. And some of the differences between Concept 1 and Concept 3 get into, at the elementary level, of how did we address some different things. And so a lot of it between 34 Highway and 75th Streets, whether we kept it more in line with the way it is today, set in motion what White Eagle would look like, what Gombert would look like, what Georgetown would look like, Fry, Peterson. So when you put those maps side by side, those were some of the key things that really kind of made that side of the district, specifically in the central and the south, evolve a little bit differently. On the north side, you'll see some differences between Brooks and Brookdale on how things are associated. The main theme in this Concept 3 at the elementary level was north of 88. We were having that area where there were islands that were going to Young. We have Young pick up that whole area. So it's one of those things that the buses are going up through those areas in those islands. Again, a different way of looking at how can you create what we would call a near neighborhood attendance area where those kids in those areas would be going to the same elementary building. There's also some differences when we get to the core area of new emerging developments, which buildings they would be assigned to. Are they at May Watts? Are they at Owens? So again, you can look at some of those things as we move through. The middle school, again, compact areas. And you'll see how the numbers start to relate between the elementary, then moving into the middle school, and then on into the high school. So again, you can see here there's a lot of high school changes because actually there's fewer high school changes in Concept 3 than Concept 1 because we tried to keep more of the existing areas at one of their original 3 high school boundaries. Concept 1 does more about, hey, you're close to the building, that's where we're going to try to associate that. So some of the things that we heard from the public inputs from the committee and from administration that we started to address were related to, again, the comments of, hey, if we are looking at, let's say, the Fox Valley Mall area, are there ways in which those could be reassigned since they're new emerging areas, again, whether they go to Owens, May Watts. So that's kind of some of the differences that occurred there. But the bigger difference was at the high school. Here we keep in Concept 3 more in line with what our existing high school boundaries are, and taking into account really trying to get the enrollments at the high school level closer to 2,700 students. And that magic 2,700 students potentially positions using the freshman center as something different, and having all the students under one roof at each of the high schools. So again, some of the things, so I mentioned in Concept 1, there was 7 of the 21 elementaries are broken. Here we have 9 of the 21. So a little bit more breaks. We still have breaks from the middle school to the high school. I give you a breakdown of what that is with the guiding principles, the boundary criteria, and then how we try to associate some of the newer comments from the public inputs and the committee. Again, we give you some of the benefits and the drawbacks, very similar again that we did with each of the concepts with the committee. Again, the big thing is the high school boundary and trying to drive towards 2,700. Again, you'll see the information of the feeders, what it is with some of the enrollments. As you can see, we have some challenges here that probably leans some of the committee members towards option or Concept 1, because we had fewer buildings that were over 95%. And then another thing that I changed from the meetings that I should have mentioned in Concept 1, when we looked at middle school and high school capacity, we changed it from being 95% to 100%. And a lot of that is related to how the students move through those classrooms. In 100%, we can have the buildings at 100% and it operates very effectively. Some of the students, when we get to the high school, they may not even be in the high school portions of the day. So we changed that to 100%. So you're going to see that in all of the tables when it relates to enrollments and capacity. And this is kind of a recommendation as we work through with administration on how those buildings actually operate differently than the elementary buildings. So can you see the projections? You'll see what it means with the special programming at each of the levels again, elementary, middle school, high school. Same thing with the housing types. So how does that relate to those 3 categories? Each of the levels. So we get into the ethnicity. Same thing where we see the changes. We highlight it as orange or green if it's greater than 5%. And then with the students impacted by the boundary change, I think there's fewer elementary students. We're at about 1,700. I think it was about 1,900 in Concept 1. Middle school, a lot of middle schoolers impacted, almost 2,800. But at the high school level, fewer students were impacted than Concept 1. Again, that proximity to the building for each of the levels. Same thing with the growth areas. Where are they associated? Again, are we planning for those growths? So that gets Concept 3. So then, if you go back to the page with the committee comments and some of those comments and then some of the desires that administration has really to hone in on this 2,700 students and how can we utilize and equalize the enrollments in each of these high schools. And then how could we even further reduce the number of students that would be impacted? Are there some things that as we just really fine slice this down to those planning areas, could we get at something that's a little bit better? So the baseline that we worked from was committee Concept 1. That's the one where we had the 65% approval. And so we worked that up from the elementary. So that was our starting block was the elementaries. And I'll pull up the maps here as we work through this. I'll have time to do that. to show you some of those changes. So what we know with this administration recommendation is that there's going to be fewer students impacted than either Concept 1 or Concept 3. And we're going to utilize the current boundaries more at each of the levels, but specifically the middle school and high school. So there's a little more familiarity. The goal of the 2,700 students, I want to publicly state this. So it was like creating equitable enrollments at all three of the buildings, right? So we don't have one of our buildings that has a lot more because we have a freshman center. The second piece is that we could relocate other district programming needs to the freshman center. And then we can allow all of the students at NEQA to be housed under one roof, not having the freshmen at the freshman center and the 10th through 12th in the other building. So this was kind of one of those goals, is we're seeing this declining enrollments, and if you go 2,700 students times 3, you get 8,400 capacity, and you can see as we get out towards the 5th year, we're right at that number of students in that capacity. So this starts to give us an understanding, what can we do with that building. So again, not minimizing what the committee did, but really trying to build on as we looked at some of the goals that we may want to achieve moving forward. So here's the visual of what is here. And I'm going to pull up my maps because I wrote some things that may be helpful in my understanding of saying what are some of these changes from Concept 1. So when I look at Concept 1, some of the changes that occurred at the elementary level occurred with Collishaw. So when we go north of 34 Highway, let's see if I can get my mouse. So right over here in this area, we moved them from May Watts down to Collishaw because the conversation with capacity at May Watts is evolving. So I think we have a 765 capacity where it's indicated that maybe we need to have more like 600 or fewer kids in that building because of the other programs and the way that space is being used. Well, we had space. If you go back to Concept 1, we had more space in Collishaw. So we moved some of these near areas to Collishaw. When we go here to south of Aurora, north of 34, we have an area that was, again, at May Watts, moved that down to Collishaw. So that was one of the changes. When I go to the middle school, the changes that we have is with Fox Valley Mall. This was at Fisher. Here we have it at Hill. We have this area that's east of the railroad. That was at Fisher. We have it at Still. Then when we come down to the south side, we go south of 103rd Street. This area in Concept 1 was at Crone Middle School. We have it at Skolin. When I go to the high school, again, the Fox Valley Mall, this was at Wabunsee. And then the big change here was, again, the familiarity with the current boundaries is keeping it more the same. So the tall grass area, it was in Concept 3. It was at Wabunsee. Concept 1, we had it in Equa. So you can see we keep more of what Wabunsee looks like on the west side of the district current to what it is now. So again, when we go over by Peterson Elementary, you can see this area has been at Wabunsee. We keep it at Wabunsee. So then we gave this table specifically with the place names. So I just kind of generally gave you the geography. So you can see what those areas are currently, what it was in Concept 1, what it was in Concept 3, and then how that relates specifically to the administration recommendation. Again, the elementary boundaries very similar to Concept 1. The high school boundaries are more closely assimilated to your current boundaries and moves enough students around that we get close to the 2,700 students in each of the high school boundaries. We have 8 of the 21 elementary buildings that are broken in the feeder, and we have the fewest number of students that are impacted by this administration recommendation. So you can see at the elementary level, about 1,500s, at the middle school, about 1,300s, and at the high school, about 350. I already mentioned all the things with what 2,700 means. Again, we've listed off how does this relate to the guiding principles? How does this relate to the input that we heard from the committee in specific? Is the middle section. And then how well does this meet the boundary criteria? The key thing in any of these concepts that we've brought forward is building utilization. What's your comfort level and what we're saying the number is, specifically at the elementary level, and what the number of students will be in each of those buildings. One of the things that was learned in this process, we can't just move the students from the north to the south and it fixes the underutilization in the south. And that was kind of one of the things that by meeting 3, it became clear that we could keep digging, and I think that's probably an ongoing question. How much farther south can you move students where it's still acceptable? And that's why I go back to the maps. The conversations that we got into was with the road network, how much time it takes to cross different streets. So we really try to be cognizant of that with any of the changes that we had. But then there's also the familiarity of the existing boundaries or road network and how they're being used. And if we change things drastically, it's going to change the way in which those traffic patterns are, right? So again, there's lots of things that you can get into in the conversation. We have what that feeder diagram looks like. Again, the explanation that you heard me kind of narrate as we move through this. We think it definitely enhances what was from concept 1 that the committee looked at. You'll see what this means with enrollment. Very similar buildings that we have 1 year where we might have greater than 95% at Brookdale or Owen or White Eagle. When we get to the middle school, you can see once we get past 22, 23, all of the middle school buildings are under 100% utilized. We get to the high school. You can see that we are pretty close. I think the gray shading, if we took the freshman center off and made that 2,700, you'll see we're right at 2,700 by the 4th year of the projections. So again, I want to clarify that since that's showing gray, it's because it's still factoring in that you have the freshman center. Take that off, 2,700, it's going to be orange because it's going to be just slightly over the capacity of 2,700. Again, you'll see what that special programming is as it relates to the current situation, the IEPs, the ELLs, FRLs, at each of the levels. It's going to be very similar as you start to push between concept 1, concept 3, depending on which one you're looking at, it's going to be pretty close to that. Same thing with the housing types, ethnicity, each of the levels again. And then the students impacted by the boundary change, I mentioned about 1,500 at the elementary, about 1,300 at the middle school, and less than 400 at the high school. Again, the transportation and proximity to buildings, how it relates to the growth areas at each of the levels. All right, I think this is where questions, comments from board members.
So the board members are going to have opportunity to question and comment at the 7 o'clock presentation also. But we do have about 11 minutes, so I will go around to the board members and see if they have any questions specifically about the process and the 3 concepts that are presented here right now. So maybe I will start with Mark.
Can you mention again what you were talking about? Capacity at the elementary levels when we see 90%. And what I mean by that is, it was my understanding that we were looking at a 25 student class size. And what does that mean specifically, 90%? Does that mean that we've run out of space for students? So if you could just touch on that again, because I just want to make sure I clearly understand it and the community does too.
Cool. Do you want to take the first stab, or you want me?
Yeah, I can
Cool.
talk briefly, and knowing we're at 11 now, 10 minutes. In general, that I think part of the challenge is focusing too much exclusively on class size for core classrooms. I think where we are seeing the need for additional space, and where we would recommend trying to be maybe below that 90%, and if there are a few buildings where we're not, where we could have challenges, is in the room for some of those supporting services. So room for our English language learners to meet with their one-on-one supports, or our special education students to meet in a one-on-one or small group environment. Right now, we have buildings that are well under capacity when looked under that sort of traditional number, and that maybe do have reasonable class sizes at that target 25, but they are using core classroom space to provide a lot of those services. So it's really trying to make sure we still have space to provide those services, and to the extent that that deals with some of our again, our English language learners, some of our special ed students, that does become tied directly to that equity piece when we talk about the guiding principles.
And if I build on this, so in most buildings, all the core rooms are being utilized for core space. When you look at that 95%, it goes back to what you're alluding to, is you take this class size of 25 times the core buildings, here's this number, and the number of students is 95% of that. So that's important, because you may go to some of the buildings and they're like, we're at 75%, but we're using all the core rooms. So it starts to get into the class sizes to determine how fully that building is being used in this concept of core rooms versus some of the ancillary space need.
And just one follow-up, then I'll let other board members ask questions. And it gets a little more difficult at the elementary level than it does at the middle school or high school level. So when we see above 90% at middle school or high school, there's a lot more flexibility and room for some of those things, correct? That's to my understanding. Okay,
That's correct.
okay. I'll wait till later.
So, given your reaction where you were like, well, maybe I'll wait, I will just ask everyone, and you can say no, I'll wait, because again, we only have about 7 minutes. So Ms. Jane, do you have any? Okay. Ms. Fosdick?
I can wait, thank you.
Okay. Mr. Krubis?
Yeah, I'll wait.
Ms. Deming?
I will wait.
Okay. Ms. Grover?
I can ask a question about the process.
Go ahead.
So regarding the process, I know December 8th was one of the meetings, it was the last meeting. Were you able to incorporate some of those ideas, because the committee didn't meet after that? Were you able to incorporate some of their recommendations or their notes?
Yeah, absolutely. In the administration recommendation, you see some things that may have morphed towards some of those comments specifically made at the committee meetings, for sure.
So I think what we'll do now is we'll move to recess, and then we'll ask the questions of the further presentation that's in the 7 o'clock session. So, Ms. Grover, if you'll make a motion.
I move that the Board of Education recess to executive session for the purpose of the appointment, employment, compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of specific employees, specific individuals who serve as independent contractors, and in part or recreational or educational setting, or specific volunteers of the public body or legal counsel for the public body, including hearing testimony on a complaint lodged against an employee, a specific individual who serves as an independent contractor in a park, recreational or education setting, or a volunteer of the public body, or against legal counsel for the public body to determine its validity. However, a meeting to consider an increase in compensation to a specific employee of a public body that is subject to the Local Government Wage Increase Transparency Act may not be closed and shall be open to the public and posted and held in accordance with this act. Litigation when an action against, affecting, or on behalf of the particular public body has been filed and is pending before a court or administrative tribunal, or when the public body finds that an action is probable or imminent, in which case the basis for the finding shall be recorded and entered into the minutes of the closed meeting. We can also go into executive session for collective negotiating matters between the public body and its employees or their representatives, or deliberations concerning salary schedules for one or more classes of employees.
Second.
Any discussion? Jeannie, will you please call the roll?
Ms. Grover.
Yes.
Mr. Rising.
Yes.
Mr. Karubis.
Yes.
Ms. Deming.
Aye.
Ms. Donahue.
Yes.
Ms. Fosdick. Ms. Jane.
Yes.
The motion passes. We are recessed to executive session.